In 2007, I was invited to give a talk on the shores of the Hudson River. At that time, I began by saying the age of nuclear power is winding down, but the age of nuclear waste is just beginning. Well, here we are. Welcome to the brave new world of human-made radioactive waste. It is a toxic legacy that will last for 100,000 years and more because no one knows how to turn off radioactivity. The only thing we can do is keep it out of the environment, keep it out of the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. Chronic exposure to radioactivity is harmful to all living things, even in small amounts, causing cancers and other diseases. It also damages the reproductive abilities of all species. Holtec wants to dump 1.3 million gallons of radioactively contaminated water into the Hudson River. Many health professionals would be appalled at the prospect of dumping any cancer-causing pollutant directly into the river. The Hudson is the source of life-giving water for animals, fish, birds, plants, insects, and of course, humans. Holtec says the wastewater was treated to remove radioactivity, but in fact, Holtec has no technology to remove a single atom of the radioactive tritium contamination. That tritium was created as a byproduct inside the Indian Point reactors. Now Holtec wants to just dump it directly into the river with no treatment whatsoever because there simply is no treatment. Last week, New York State passed a law prohibiting the dumping because it would further degrade the water quality of the Hudson River, which is already suffering from serious PCB contamination. Unlike PCBs, which are very difficult to remove from drinking water, tritium is impossible to remove. It all goes right to the tap. Halfway around the world, Japan wants to dump 1.3 million metric tons of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. They plan to start tomorrow, August 24th. The dumping has been vehemently opposed by Japanese fishermen, as well as the governments of South Korea, China, and several Pacific Island nations, including independent scientists around the world. The contaminated water in Japan comes from the triple meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi 12 years ago. Huge amounts of fresh water had to be used every day since the accident to cool the melted cores of the crippled reactors. That water has become heavily contaminated and has been accumulating year after year. Japan now wants to dump it all into the Pacific Ocean over a period of 30 years. Like Holtec, the Japanese cannot remove the tritium. So what is happening at Indian Point is really part of a global pattern. Industry wants to rid itself of the responsibility of looking after at least some of the voluminous toxic waste that it has created. Let me explain the particular problem with tritium. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very important element. It is by far the most abundant element in the entire universe. It has the simplest possible atom, a single proton at the center and a solitary electron in orbit around that. Two hydrogen atoms are found in every water molecule, and water covers 75% of the Earth's surface. More importantly, every living thing requires water. Each living cell is filled with at least 2/3 water by mass. Every organic molecule in our bodies, all the carbohydrates, the proteins, the lipids, even the DNA molecules, are made up mainly by splicing carbon and hydrogen atoms together. Tritium is, as I said, radioactive hydrogen. It is created as a byproduct inside every nuclear power reactor. It behaves exactly the same way that normal hydrogen behaves, except that the tritium atom is unstable or radioactive. Every tritium atom will suddenly disintegrate without warning. Ordinary hydrogen atoms just don't do that. Now, a radioactive disintegration is a kind of subatomic explosion. It emits a piece of subatomic shrapnel called atomic radiation, very harmful to nearby living cells because it breaks molecular bonds at random, including DNA. Now, if a cell with damaged DNA reproduces, it can develop into a cancer, or it can give rise to genetic illnesses in future offspring. Defective embryos may also result in a pregnant female. In any population of creatures, chronic exposure to atomic radiation causes an increase of cancers of many kinds. Atomic radiation also damages reproductive cells, such as eggs and sperm. These genetic damages can be passed on as maladies to offspring and even transmitted to future generations. Genetic damage occurs in every species that has been studied in the laboratory. Evaporation of tritium-contaminated water, which is also called tritiated water, results in airborne radioactive water vapor. When it condenses, it comes back to Earth as radioactive dewdrops, or radioactive raindrops, or radioactive snowflakes. Breathing in radioactive water vapor is much more biologically damaging than drinking radioactive water or eating food with organically bound tritium. Organically bound tritium is tritium that has been incorporated into organic molecules. In Canada and other countries, large volumes of tritium-contaminated water have been stored for years at a time in stainless steel drums, carefully sealed to prevent evaporation. The International Atomic Energy Agency points out that stainless steel drums can last for over 100 years before being replaced, and in that time, over 99% of the tritium atoms will have disintegrated harmlessly inside those containers. Other containers can also be used, such as rubber bladders. One of the best containers that can be used is thick glass. There is no reason why the Indian Point tritiated water could not be stored for a century or more rather than dumping it into the Hudson River. A river is not a radioactive waste facility, nor should it be treated as a radioactive sewer. More broadly, we as citizens of planet Earth should resist the inevitable pressures from nuclear promoters and defenders to allow the unwise dispersal of human-made radioactive waste materials into the environment of living things or into articles of commerce, such as radioactively contaminated scrap metal that ends up yielding such things as radioactive zippers, radioactive safety pins, radioactive knives and forks, etc. Just a final few words, if I may, about tritium. Do not believe spokespersons of the nuclear establishment when they say that the total radiation dose from tritium is, quote, negligible, unquote. Negligible means it can be neglected, and it is being neglected. That's not a solution to pollution. They have been singularly unscientific in dealing with the data about tritium. The nuclear establishment downplays or ignores or even denies the following points. First, the well-established fact that tritium is at least 2 or 3 times more biologically damaging in comparison with gamma radiation once it's inside the body, and maybe up to 15 times more damaging. Second, the fact that a large population exposed to a small dose will show the same number of radiation-induced cancers as a small population exposed to a correspondingly large dose. So by spreading tritium into the Hudson River, we're exposing an inordinately large number of living organisms to tritium that don't have to be exposed. The important role of organically bound tritium in bioaccumulation and biomagnification is also ignored by the nuclear establishment, as well as the fact that females typically store twice as much tritium in their body fat than similarly sized males. 3 more points. The establishment ignores the deleterious effects of tritium on developing embryos and the fact that tritium is routinely incorporated directly into DNA molecules, unlike any other radioactive material except carbon-14. The fact that tritium, when released to the environment, remains in the environment for 1 or 2 centuries is conveniently ignored. Thank you for your attention. I do think that public understanding of the nature of the problem is important. Once they understand that tritium really makes radioactive water molecules, and that's why it cannot be removed from drinking water, either in the river itself by Holtec or in your own home. And it's also important to realize that although tritium is completely harmless outside the body, because when it disintegrates, it gives off a particle called a beta particle that has a very short range. It's only able to affect one or two cells at a time. Nevertheless, inside the body, it is much more dangerous than gamma radiation, and consequently, it's once you drink it or eat food contaminated with it, that's once people start to understand that, then I think you can have an aroused public opinion much more easily. So I think the key to public vigilance is public understanding, and one has to strip away the mystification that the industry and the regulator are equally guilty of mystifying people, so that they feel unable to understand what the problem is. If I may add that it's very important that Holtec be prevented, because this is not covered by the law. Holtec be prevented from evaporating the water. Evaporating the water simply gives you radioactive water vapor, and it does come down both as rain and snow and dew, but it also enters the air, and breathing radioactive water vapor, tritium contaminated water vapor, is actually more harmful biologically than drinking the water or eating the food that is contaminated with tritium. So evaporation is no solution, just as dilution is no solution. Evaporation is also no solution. So just one more point, and that is that in order to really address the problem of tritium, one has to have the use of a laboratory which can sample, and you can't really detect tritium directly. It doesn't register on radiation alarm. It doesn't trigger radiation alarm. It's because of the very peculiar kind of radiation given off by tritium, which is not very penetrating. You may think, well, if it's not very penetrating, it's probably not very dangerous. On the contrary, the radiation which is less penetrating is actually far more dangerous, because all of the energy is delivered to one or two cells, and the biological damage is much more concentrated in the body. For example, plutonium also, the radiation from plutonium can't pass through a sheet of paper, and yet it's hundreds of times more dangerous than any other radioactive material. So the fact that it's not penetrating is not a indication of safety at all. I think one has to realize that we have entered the age of nuclear waste big time, and that this is going to be a struggle that's going to be our children and grandchildren's struggle too. And we have to set an example to them today, because this is the thin edge of the wedge. Once they start dumping stuff into the river and dumping stuff into the marketplace, there's no end to it. And our environment is going to become increasingly unhealthy because increasingly radioactive. And don't bear in mind that although they often talk about background radiation, that we do get a certain amount of radiation from background, it's true, there is background radiation. But guess what? It's killing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people every single year, background radiation. So don't think that background radiation is safe just because it's background. And number two, most of the radioactive materials we're talking about don't even exist in nature. They were created, they only started existing 80 years ago when nuclear fission was invented. So we have created hundreds of new radioactive materials that don't even exist in nature. And we have to be very much on the alert, because this problem is not going to go away even if the nuclear industry goes away. And we have to really be protective of our children, our grandchildren, and in fact, the biosphere.